Good evening. Good evening. My name is Juan Carlos Martinez. I'm the campus minister for Reformed University Fellowship, or RUF, which is one of the Christian ministries here on campus. You should also know that I'm a Rice alumnus, and I know that God loves me because I'm from a Bakerite by the grace of God. It's true. It's my distinct pleasure and honor to welcome you this evening to our event entitled Has Science Buried God?, where we'll be considering the relationship between science and faith in light of modern scientific discoveries and recent debates. This undoubtedly is a topic that is of great interest to the general public, but it's of particular interest to our community here at Rice University, given our school's heavy involvement in research. So whether you're here at McMurtry Auditorium in Duncan Hall, or in one of our overflow rooms, or joining us via live stream at the Story Church, we believe this is going to be a special evening for all of us. I need to get through a couple of housekeeping items before introducing our evening speaker. First of all, I'd like to publicly thank Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, as well as West University Baptist Church for sponsoring our event this evening. I also want to thank the Story Church for hosting our live stream audience, as well as Houston's First Baptist Church downtown for sponsoring the reception that will follow and which will take place in the atrium. I also want to thank the campus ministries who helped put this together, namely Chi Alpha, the Baptist Student Ministry, the Navigators, Crew, the Rice Graduate Fellowship, Rice Graduate Christian Fellowship, and Reformed University Fellowship. I got that one right. Finally, please note that after the lecture and before the reception, there will be a Q&A session, so take notes and text the questions as they come. Text RiceQ plus your question to 22333, and you'll see this listed up here on the wall. As the questions come, make sure you begin texting them to that number. Now, without further ado, it's my honor to introduce this evening's speaker. Dr. John Lennox is a professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford and emeritus fellow in mathematics and the philosophy of science at Green Templeton College, Oxford. He's also an associate fellow of the Said Business School, Oxford University, and teaches for the Oxford Strategic Leadership Program. I know you're impressed, but settle in, I'm just getting started. Besides being a senior fellow at the Trinity Forum, Dr. Lennox is adjunct lecturer at Wycliffe Hall, Oxford University, and at the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. Dr. Lennox is one of the leading thinkers in the area of faith and science and has participated in a number of televised debates with some of the world's leading thinkers, such as Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens. You should also know that Dr. Lennox holds 3 doctorates, speaks 5 languages, has written a number of books on the interface between science, philosophy, and theology, has more than 70 published mathematical papers, and is co-author of 2 research-level texts in algebra. Please help me welcome Dr. John Lennox.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the warmth of that welcome. You know, I'm an amateur bird watcher, and I've been looking for Sammy the Owl, but I haven't seen him yet. So perhaps I'll see him before my visit is over. This is now the 2nd time I've been at this distinguished university, and the first time I was asked to talk to you about the very difficult question of suffering and evil. This time, the question is, has science buried God? And to every speaker, there belongs a biography. And we can approach this in 2 ways. One way is simply to go into the subject from an intellectual perspective. But the other way, which I think you might find a little more interesting, is to approach it through my own story. I come originally from a very small country called Northern Ireland. Most of you have never heard of it, which hasn't always had a great reputation for its practicing of religion. It has been more often associated with terrorism on both sides. I grew up in a family that wasn't well educated, but they valued education. And my parents loved me enough to give me space to think and encouraged me to think in many different directions. And that's why I was delighted to see the motto of your university: letters, science, and art. Because you see, pure mathematics embodies all three of them simultaneously. So perhaps that's why I feel at home in the context of your university. Language always has fascinated me. From the spectrum of natural language to the most highly compressed language we know, that is the language of mathematics. And we use language to describe things. And the fascinating thing is that we can grip within the spectrum of the natural languages all the range of emotions and literature that stimulates people and fills them full of great ideas. But then as we go across that spectrum and go down to mathematics and to computer languages, we have this amazing phenomenon that we can actually grasp something about our universe in terms of mathematics. And really clever people, and Einstein was one of them, I think you'll agree, saw that there was a big issue here. How does that work? How can we describe the universe in terms of mathematics? And I'm sure all of us have thought that. I thought about it as a small child. How does language work? What is the mind? Is it simply the brain? Or is it more than that? And I was stimulated, first of all, by my parents to begin to think of big questions. As a child, I loved arithmetic and used to ask for extra homework at school, which didn't always endear me to my fellow pupils. But nevertheless, mathematics, language, science, where does it fit? Does it fit in any bigger picture, or is that it? Once we get science with all its marvelous technological spin-offs, have we really grasped the whole universe or not? Now, I grew up in a context which was not just the intellectual context of science and learning. My parents were Christians. They were very unusual Christians, in that in a very sectarian country, they were not sectarian. My father was so convinced that every human being was of infinite value because they were made in the image of God, that he employed equally from the Roman Catholic and the Protestant sides. We got bombed for that. It was a very expensive thing to do. And I nearly lost my brother. They put 300 stitches in his face to put his face back on after a bomb had been put in our business. So in that sense, my parents paid for the expression of a faith that I discovered as I grew up in this family was alive. Because you see, the impression given to many people is that Christianity narrows folk down. Christopher Hitchens, whom I so enjoyed debating and lament his passing, religion poisons everything. Now, if you'd said that to me as a child, I would say, pardon? My experience of religion has been the exact opposite. Christianity is expansive. It encourages intellectual curiosity. It has driven me to be interested in virtually everything there is. What do you mean it poisons everything? Of course, I later learned what he meant. But in that sense, I had a good start, because many of my contemporaries coming from Northern Ireland had a religion rammed down their throat. And of course, the moment they got to university, they left it completely behind. I hadn't. So I arrived in Cambridge in 1962, not 1862, just so that you don't get the wrong impression. 1962. And some of you may have heard of C.S. Lewis. He was still teaching at Cambridge then, and I was able to hear the last of his lectures. And you see, I'm a mathematician. He was an English don, but his influence on my thinking has been absolutely colossal, because although he was a humanities man, he loved science. So I'm very happy between the humanities and the sciences as I talk to you tonight. Now, I suppose the most important thing that happened to me at Cambridge was on day one I saw a beautiful vision. She was 16. And I've now been married to her for 47 years. But we'll... But you wouldn't know anything about that, so I leave that aside. But that was point one. But now let's come to the relevant points. Sometimes life's challenges come early on. I'd been encouraged to think, and more importantly, I'd been encouraged to take seriously other people's worldviews. Now, every one of us in this place tonight, we've got a worldview. And it's being formed at Rice University. It's partially formed in our homes and so on and so forth. And my father, though not well educated, saw that if I was going to be serious, I needed to read other stuff. And I remember him handing to me when I was 13 the Communist Manifesto. And he said, John, have you read this? I said, no, not recently, Dad. So he said, I think you ought to read it. Why? Well, he said, you need to know what other people think. Now, that was such an enlightened statement. You need to know what other people think. And he said, if your Christian faith is going to be real, you will have to learn firsthand that it's got answers to the big questions of life. Now, that was very unusual parenting and risky in a way, because he was introducing me at a very early age to the fact that not everyone held the same worldview. Now, I come to Cambridge, and I'd not met many atheists and agnostics in Ireland. Of course, there were Protestant atheists and Catholic atheists, but you didn't meet you didn't meet many real atheists. And I remember in my first week at university, a student at dinner, rather too loudly, he said to me, do you believe in God? And I said, oh dear, I'm sorry, I really am, because all you Irish, you believe in God and you fight about it. Now, I'd heard that many times before, but somehow it was real. I thought, well, yes, my parents Christian, my grandparents Christian, their parents Christian. Well, it's Irish genetics, that's what it is. That's all it is. And Freud has a brilliant explanation of it. All you Irish living in your tiny island full of fairies and leprechauns, you've just invented a big god to comfort yourselves, while the rest of the world sails by and is real and realistic as it faces up to the reality that there's nothing beyond the material world. So what did I do? I'd read a lot, but I hadn't talked a lot to people who really believed differently from me. So I decided on that day that I would get to know people really well as friends who did not share my worldview. So in my case, it was people who'd never been to church, whose parents had never been to church, who weren't really interested in God and so on. And I've been doing it all my life. I've spent my entire life exposing my faith in God to its opposite. Now, I'll explain to you a little bit what that has involved. Little did I know in those days that my capacity for languages was going to prove very useful in this quest. But starting in Cambridge, I entered into dialogue with a brilliant mathematician, far brighter than me. He was the brightest in our year and is a world-class logician. And I can remember after a year of discussion, the day he came to me and I thought, there's something different about you. I said, what's up? Well, he said, I need to tell you, he said, last night I knelt on the floor of my room in college and I became a Christian. Now that was a very big event because it told me that worldviews are not fixed. It told me that it's possible to move. And therefore, all of my life, from my perspective, I've been attempting to befriend some of the leading atheists in the world in order to find out, now listen to this, whether or not, just as I believe that my science is at least an approximation to the truth, that my faith in God cogs into reality and truth at an even deeper level. And so what did that do? Just briefly to summarize, I got my undergraduate degrees, and then I was told it'd be good for my health to go and study in Germany. But I did something that not everybody does. I learned the language fluently so that I could lecture in it and all the rest. And then I started traveling to Eastern Europe during the Cold War. You've probably heard of it. And in East Germany, where I could pass without being noticed because I spoke German, I studied the systematic effect of atheism on a culture. That was so illuminating. And when the wall fell and I helped knock it down, my wife sent me over to do that, which is an interesting task for a wife to give her husband. And I've still got a bit of it in my desk. When the wall fell down, I started going to Russia because for a lot of my academic life, I've been a professional translator of mathematical Russian. So they sent me to Siberia, but they gave me a two-way ticket. They sent me to Siberia. And there I was exposed to some of the leading scientists in the world who'd been subjected to 75 years of an atheist worldview. So here I was coming from a Western culture that was dominated in my youth, it isn't now, by Christianity, to make friends with people who came from the exact opposite spectrum. And we were mathematicians, we believed the same things about mathematics. And so we entered into discussion about these very big questions. So that's a little brief history. I had no idea, of course, at the time that this was preparing me to go on the world stage to have a little chat with Richard Dawkins about some of these things, and Christopher Hitchens and Peter Singer and Michael Shermer and a whole host of other people. And I do it, ladies and gentlemen, simply because I believe that the public deserves to hear both sides of the story. You see, if we step back from all of this, what we discover is, roughly speaking, right since ancient times, there have been two, or possibly three, dominant worldviews. Now, I love the classics. I've had the very great privilege of having a formal public scientific education and a private classical education, because I've worked all my life with a professor of Latin and Greek. And he has introduced me to the wealth of thinking that comes from the ancient world. And I soon learned that there's nothing new under the sun. That at the time of my intellectual heroes Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, there were two major worldviews competing. There were the brilliant atomists like Democritus and Leucippus, who had this phenomenal idea that there were things called atoms, atomos, something that cannot be cut. Now, we, of course, know they can be cut, but it was a brilliant idea, and they used it to explain the universe. In the following sense, they said there are two basic things in existence, atoms and empty space. And you can explain the entire phenomena of the physical universe in terms of those two things. They were the forerunners of Richard Dawkins, the ancient materialists. Because you see, having that idea about the universe conditions the way they conceive explanation. I'm going to talk to you a little bit in a while about the nature of explanation, particularly scientific explanation. But you can understand, if you start by believing there are only atoms and empty space, and you use those two things to explain everything, you've got what's called bottom-up explanation, or to put it another way, reductionist explanation, because you're reducing everything to physics and chemistry. Does that make sense? At the same time as they were doing their brilliant thinking about atoms, there were people like Socrates and Plato and so on who said, there's more than that. There's something more. There is transcendence. There is evidence of mind behind the universe. And some of them even believed that there was a single God, though many of them believed there were many gods. And so barreling up through the centuries into the 21st century academy, you've got those two worldviews. Now, I know there are others. Pantheism is a major one. But in the discourse today, we have these two conflicting worldviews, and now science comes floating into the middle of it. The title of our talk tonight is, Has Science Buried God? And it's a popular view that science is on the one hand and religion on the other. Science has trumped everything. Forget religion, and as science advances, God has been wiped out. And it is the intention, explicit intention of the so-called new atheists to destroy every kind of religion in our generation. But let's face the question, has science buried God? Clearly not. Because take the Nobel Prize for Physics, which is a pretty high-powered prize, isn't it? Last year, or the year before, it was won by Peter Higgs. Peter Higgs is a Scotsman. He's an atheist, pleasant atheist. And a few years before that, it was won by Bill Phillips, who's an American Christian. Now think about those two men. They're equally brilliant physicists. They won the same prize. So they're not divided by their science. Can you see that? Well, what divides them? Their worldview. One's an atheist, the other's a theist, a Christian. Now, let's try and get this, because this will help you to understand what's going on in our culture. The tension is not between science and God at all, I would suggest. I've never sensed one. I've never seen one. And I want to argue that the tension's not there, but there is a real tension. It's a worldview tension. And what's happening is that people on both sides are saying science is on our side. Richard Dawkins will tell you that science leads to atheism. I will tell you the exact opposite. So I'm going to simply explain why, and you can make up your minds and listen to Richard Dawkins to get the other side. In fact, you can even listen to Richard Dawkins and myself discussing it on YouTube if you would like to do that. So here's the question. You've got these two worldviews, atheism, theism, and let's imagine science in the middle. Where does it point? Is it neutral? Does it point toward atheism? Does it point towards theism? How would you answer a question like that? Well, if you had any sense, you'd start with history. Where does modern science come from? Now, that's a question that's always interested me, and it interested me a great deal more when I discovered that modern science arose in Western Europe. Notice the emphasis on modern. Modern science arose in Western Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries in a Christian culture. Has the Christian culture got anything to do with it? Of course. Indeed, C.S. Lewis, when he wrote about this, and he was really giving a summary of Alfred North Whitehead's views, he said, men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law in nature. Why? Because they believed in the lawgiver. Now, here's a very strange thing. It's puzzled me for years. And it's this. Far from being a hindrance to science, belief in God was the motor that drove it. That's a staggeringly interesting fact. Let me repeat it in case you've misheard. Far from being a hindrance to science, belief in God was the motor that drove it. Let me put that even more bluntly. I am not remotely embarrassed here in one of the best universities in the world to say I'm a scientist and a Christian, because arguably Christianity gave me my subject. Now that's the start. How is it that we've got to the situation in the 21st century where leading scientists like Stephen Hawking tell us we've got to choose between science and God, when the original pioneers who were geniuses, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, Babbage, and so on, were all believers in God? How has it happened that the culture has now changed so that the general view is, has science buried God? Now, just excuse me a moment, because I want a drink of water. So we'll have a little look at this and try to explain why this is happening. When you think of science and the God question, often the first thing we meet, and you'll see it in the titles of books, is that the first science that's used to bury God is psychology. The God delusion. How many of you have read The God Delusion? Well, 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 I ought to be delighted, I suppose. So few of you. But delusion is a psychiatric word, as you know. Is God a delusion? And it's quite humorous sometimes. I get into very many interesting debates. And I was in the Netherlands last year debating in 2 universities, in TU Delft and in Groningen. They're both leading universities. In the first case, I was debating a physicist, and the second, a sociologist. And they both used exactly the same argument. They said, well, of course, Professor Lennox, your God is like Santa Claus. And really, it's an insult to our intelligence to be invited to believe in Santa Claus and so on. The good old Freudian argument, there's a nice Santa Claus up in the sky. And I feel this personally, actually, this Santa Claus thing, because we used to ask our students when I was in the University of Wales why they'd come to the university. And one girl in maths, he said, well, I got this printed thing with photographs of seminars and so on. And I saw this photograph, and that man just looked like Santa Claus, so I came here. The man was me. So I feel it a bit, you know, when people accuse me of believing in Santa Claus, because I am Santa Claus. So there's strong evidence for his existence. So I put it to the audience. I said, this professor of physics thinks my belief in God is like belief in Santa Claus. Let me put it to you, ladies and gentlemen. Put up your hand if you came to believe in Santa Claus as an adult. And there was a deafening silence. Not a hand went up. And then I said, put up your hand if you came to believe in God as an adult. And many hands went up. And I said, please don't insult our intelligence. For centuries, some of the brightest minds in the world have taken God seriously. Virtually every single major university in Europe was founded on a Christian foundation. Why is it that Oxford has as a motto, Dominus illuminatio mea, the Lord is my light, and again you can repeat that. Harvard, Veritas, the truth. Why is that? Because the great thinkers were Christian. It's not that there weren't great thinkers on the other side, but we live in such a little bubble in history. We've been conditioned to think that Christians are dumb and that atheists are, well, they call themselves the brights. At least Hitchens had the grace to disagree with that nomenclature. So let's get away from this Freudian notion, but I want to say something about it, because it's often the first science that stops people considering the God question. Because they're told, look, it's obvious, Lennox, why you believe in God, Irish heredity, wish fulfillment, and all the rest of it. There's a brilliant psychiatrist, one of Germany's leading psychiatrists, Manfred Lutz. He's written a book called Eine kleine Geschichte des Größten, which means a brief history of the great one, of God. And he says this. He said, if there is no God, of course the Freudian argument that God is a projection of our father wishes is brilliant, if there is no God. But of course, he says, if there is a God, the Freudian argument shows that atheism is a wish fulfillment. The desire not to have to meet God to account for all that we've done wrong and so on. You see, the argument works both ways, and it's useless. Let me illustrate it, if you don't mind me being personal. But Stephen Hawking was asked not long ago what he thought of religion. Well, he said it's a fairy story for people who are afraid of the dark. And so I was asked to comment, and I did. I said, well, by the same token, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Well, you don't prove anything by statements like that. They're pretty trivial. The basic thing is that neither Freud, Jung, Frankl, or any psychiatrist or psychologist can decide the question whether there's a God or not. So we need to go deeper into the question of evidence. Now, the first bit of evidence I've given you is evidence about from history. The second bit is going to have to do with the confusion that exists today about the nature of God. I used to think the whole problem was science, but it's not. There's a confusion about the nature of God. When I was younger and I talked about God, people would understand what I meant. The God who created the universe, who sustains the universe, but who's not part of it, nor dependent on it. It comes from him. He doesn't come from it. But now you see, many of my colleagues think that I think that God is a God of the gaps, like the Greek god of thunder. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. That kind of a God. So when you have a little bit of scientific advance at your university, that God disappears, obviously. Now listen to me very carefully, because this is so important in understanding what's going on. If you believe that God is the God of the gaps, of course you have to do what Stephen Hawking says and choose between science and God, because that is the way you've defined God. Do you see that? If you define God simply as a placeholder, as an X that somehow explains what science has not yet explained, so that gods get smaller, science gets bigger, well, of course you'd have to choose between science and God. But you see, the biblical view of God is that God is the author of the whole show, the bits we understand, the bits we don't understand. You've probably heard that Genesis opens with the words, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth." It doesn't begin with the words, "In the beginning God created the bits of the universe I don't understand." I mean, that would be absurd. But this is vastly important, because once we've grasped that, we see this Greek gods argument just simply doesn't work. Now, Newton could see that. When he discovered his law of gravity, he didn't say, "Wonderful, now I understand how this universe works. I don't need God." No, what did he do? He wrote the Principia Mathematica, the most brilliant book in the history of science, hoping, as he said in the foreword, that a thinking person might come to believe in a deity through it. The more he understood of science, the more he admired the God who did it that way. That's the way you think too, isn't it? The more you know of engineering, the more you can admire space shuttle. The more you know of art, the more you can admire Rembrandt, not the less. Now, here's where the problem comes. Newton held the same chair in Cambridge as Stephen Hawking. Newton didn't, in that sense, believe in a God of the gaps. So as his understanding of the universe grew, so grew his admiration for God. Stephen Hawking, who holds the same chair, believes that I believe in a God of the gaps. And so he uses gravity, the very same thing that Newton used to be evidence for the existence of God. Stephen Hawking uses it as evidence for the non-existence of God. That's fascinating to me. And so I ask questions about how that has happened. We'll come to that in just a moment. Now, behind that lies something very important. When we say science explains, what do we mean? Now think about that. I learned the law of, we'll stay with the law of gravity because most of us have heard about it. And I remember being so excited when I could deduce the motions of the planets and teach students their elliptical orbits based on an equation with 8 symbols in it. That was heady stuff, you know. So this law of gravity, what does it explain? Well, when I was at school, I thought it explained gravity. It doesn't, you know. Nobody knows what gravity is. And if you don't believe me, read Richard Feynman, who was one of the most brilliant physicists of the 20th century in Caltech. You see, the law of gravity gives us a brilliant way of doing mathematical calculations that are so accurate that they're enough to land a person on the moon without any Einsteinian relativistic corrections. It doesn't tell you what gravity is, and Newton knew that. So when somebody comes along and says science explains, I says, what level does it explain? What is the thing you're bringing to me? How much does it explain? Because we still don't know what gravity is. So even within science itself, you haven't got a complete explanation within the realm of science, let alone anything else. That's point number one. Point number two is there are self-evidently different levels of explanation. Why is the water boiling? Well, because the heat energy from the gas flame is being conducted through the copper base of the kettle. It's agitating the molecules of water, and they're moving faster and faster and faster, and steam's beginning to throw up and so on. That's why it's boiling. Nonsense. It's boiling because I need a cup of tea. Now, the interesting thing is you're laughing. Now, I wonder why you're laughing. Are you laughing because I said it was nonsense? I think so. Because you can see instantly that those two explanations don't compete, they don't conflict, they complement, yes. And you need both of them. And sometimes I say to my scientific colleagues, God no more competes with science as an explanation than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for a motor car engine. It would be absurd, and I sometimes do it with kids at school. And they can grasp something I find some professors cannot understand. That Henry Ford is a different kind of explanation. He's the explanation of why there's a motor car at all. But you won't find him by studying a motor car, you know. You can study a motor car engine for 1,000 years, you never find Henry Ford. His imprint, his fingerprints are all over him. But you won't find him. Similarly with the universe. I want to argue that God as an explanation doesn't compete with science because he's not that kind of explanation. As someone has put it, God is the explanation of why there are scientific explanations, indeed of why there exists a universe which is capable of being explained scientifically. So there are two levels, and there are several more actually, of explanation in terms of, let's capture this, in terms of, on the one hand, law and mechanism, let's say, and on the other hand of agency. And we normally need both. Now, the vast amount of science is not dealing with the agency question. It's dealing with how does this work? Where does that fit? Why does that bit go there? What is this material made out of? How can we construct a nanomachine that does this and so on? It's not raising those big questions. But of course, we are used these days to hearing these questions raised in certain, quite narrow areas of science, mostly having to do with origins. So we need to keep a sense of perspective here. And it's just fascinating to me that that confusion about scientific explanation, once you get it clear, it defuses a whole lot of things. Because you can get on with your science, and I hope many of you are passionate scientists. You can get on with that, and if you're a believer in God, you do it to the glory of God. What a fascinating thing it is to study the universe, because there's no competition. Now, of course, I realize that Richard Dawkins will come here and say, talking about explanation. God can't be an explanation of anything, of course, can he? Because by definition, he's more complex than the thing you're explaining. And explanation, we're taught, goes from the simple to the complex, doesn't it? You take a complex thing, you reduce it to simple things. That's explanation. You don't explain something simple in terms of something more complex. Yes? So God isn't an explanation, so let's stop and do something more interesting like football. Okay? Well, let's think about that for a moment or two. Let's try it out on Richard Dawkins. I pick up a book, it's called The God Delusion. It's got 400 pages, it's quite complicated. And then I ask, what's its origin? And somebody says, well, it actually originates in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. I say, well, that's no explanation, because your explanation is more complex than the thing you're explaining. What? You see, what's going on here is very important. It's wonderful when we can do reductionist science. But there's one major area where explanations are always more complex than the thing you're explaining, and yet they're real explanations. Can I illustrate this with a story? We have a wonderful college in Oxford, and we have nice dinners love to invite you all to one, but we couldn't hold you all. Candlelit dinners Thursday night, but the snag is you can't choose where you sit. So this night I discovered I was beside a world-famous biochemist who ran the biggest lab in Oxford. And he made the mistake of asking me what I did. I'm a pure mathematician. He said, how dreadfully boring. So I backed off and I thought, this is awful. I said, but anyway, I know that my subject is very abstruse and socially inadequate and everything else. And I tried to make up for it, you see, by being interested in the big question. What big questions? Well, I said, like the status of the universe. Is it created or not? He said, stop. He said, it's far worse than I thought. He said, listen, I am a reductionist. I'm an atheist. We've nothing to talk about. We're going to have a horrible evening. Well, that was a minimal challenge, wasn't it? So I said, no, we're not. We are going to have a fascinating evening. I said, reductionism, I'm really fascinated by it. I know at least 3 kinds. What kind are you? So I had to help him out just a little bit, but that was all right. I said, I'm a methodological reductionist. Take a big problem, split it into little problems, try and solve the little problems, gives me insight in the big ones. Well, he said, I do that too. Well, I said, no, we got something to talk about. It's not all that bad. No, I suppose it isn't, he said, but I didn't mean that. I said, I know you didn't. You are an ontological reductionist. Ontos, Greek for being. Everything in terms of physics and chemistry. He said, that's what I am, and that's my problem. Well, I said, why don't we do an experiment? He said, what, here at the dinner table? I said, yes, this is Oxford. So I picked up the menu, and he looked at it, roast chicken. Said, what's the problem? I said, none, where I'm concerned. But look at it, R-O-A-S-T. Those are marks on paper, aren't they? Yes, he said, but they mean roast chicken. I said, how do you know? And I said, here's my question. R-O-A-S-T, those marks mean something to you. Now, you can reduce everything to physics and chemistry. He said, of course. I said, okay, here's your problem. Explain to me the semiotics, the way in which those marks put like that in a string carry meaning. And you explain it to me using only the physics and chemistry of the paper and ink. And there was a silence. But his wife was there, and rather unkindly she said, get out of that if you can. But he didn't try. His answer was stunning. He said, I've tried to do it for 40 years. He said, every day I come into the lab, I believe that everything can be materially reduced. And now I see it can't be. I was absolutely stunned. It's so much so that I played the Irishman and played devil's advocate and said, look here, physics and chemistry have only been going sensibly for 600 or 700 years. He said, it doesn't matter. It's not within the explanatory power of physics and chemistry to deal with language. Now let me push that a little bit. He studied DNA. He saw a 5-letter word, R-O-A-S-T, on a menu, and he inferred intelligence, even though he knew that there were many automatic processes involved in producing that menu. But nevertheless, the nature of it told him, you've got to bring in not simply physics and chemistry, you've got to bring in an input of intelligent information into the system. And he was recognizing that as a scientist. So what about DNA then? 3.5 billion letters in the right order. I asked my colleagues about it. Where does that originate? The longest word we've ever discovered. Oh, they say chance and necessity. What? Chance and the laws of nature? Yes. R-O-A-S-T, mind. I get the impression there's a problem somewhere. And of course the problem is simple. It's worldview limiting what you can use as explanation. You're not allowed to use an input of intelligence, even though The system demands it. You do it happily with a menu, but you don't realize that you're giving the game away because you're being inconsistent when you don't do it with DNA. Now, I want to follow that just for a moment, because I'm very interested in the fact that I can do mathematics. Not very well, I do my best. But some of my colleagues, and there are some brilliant scientists in this room, and getting their physics and their chemistry to gear into the universe out there, I find that a source of unending wonder. Eugen Wigner, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, wrote a paper in 1961 called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. I disagree with them, except it depends on your point of view. He's an atheist. And he thought, well, how can it work that a mathematician, she's thinking in here, she comes up with equations, they describe the physical universe out there. How could that possibly happen? Well, let's pursue it. Sometimes I have a bit of fun because I like to get to know my colleagues, and I ask them, what do you do science with? Oh, they say, I've got this billion-dollar machine. Said it didn't quite mean that. I mean, oh, you mean mind? And they're just about to say mind when they remember there's no such thing as mind. And so they say brain. Well, I happen to believe there is such a thing as a mind. But I say, never mind. You do it with your brain. Tell me about the brain. They said, do you want the long story? No, I want the short story. Well, in the end, the brain, of course, is a natural phenomenon. It is a product of unguided natural forces. Oh, I said, really? And you trust it? Yes. Well, now, tell me, I said, you use a computer? Yes, of course I do. Got a supercomputer, 3 of them, actually. What would you do if you knew it was the result of unguided natural forces? He said, I'd scrap it. Oh, that's interesting. Why don't you scrap your brain then? Now, this is important. Do you know who first thought of that objection? Charles Darwin. Listen to him. Darwin's doubt, with me the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. That doubt persists. C.S. Lewis in the 1940s wrote a prescient book on it, The Abolition of Man. And he said roughly this, that any theory that invalidates human thought is by definition invalid. And he points out what is obviously true when you think about it. Science has been very successful because we're using the human mind to study the natural world. But he said what we haven't done is have a look at the mind that's doing the studying. Because there, if you start to attempt to explain, you're going to run into difficulties. Now, it's very interesting that one of the world's leading atheist thinkers, Thomas Nagel of New York, has begun to see the problem, and he has caused consternation in cyberspace. He's written a book that has the most explosive subtitle I've ever read. The book title is innocent, Mind and Cosmos. The subtitle is not innocent. Now, this is an atheist. He's such a strong atheist, he doesn't want there to be a God. He has that in writing. But he says, the subtitle of the book is, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. Wow, I thought when I read that. But his argument was what was interesting to me. Because he's picking up Darwin, he's picking up Lewis, and he's picking up leading thinkers like Alvin Plantinga, and he comes to this. If the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism depends. What he's saying, in short, is it's pretty risky to shoot yourself in the foot. That can be painful. But to shoot yourself in the brain is fatal. Do you see the argument? Now, I'm going to say this in a very provocative way and hope that you'll stimulate some discussion among you. Science hasn't buried God, But atheism is on its way to bury science, because it undermines the very rationality that we need to do science. Now, of course, you can hold those views and still do science because you believe the mind works, but you've no rational justification for it. And that's why science arose in a Christian culture, because they expected to be able to study nature, at least in part, because they believed that there was a rational mind behind the whole of creation. Now, this is where, of course, the thing begins to come very interesting. I could talk to you about other evidences from the results of science. So far, I've just been talking about the philosophy of science, and I put that first because I think it's most important. But I could talk to you about scientific evidence that there's a beginning, which raises the question of the causation of the whole universe. I could talk to you about nothing. That is, all these theories of getting a universe from nothing, and you might want to ask me about them. I could talk to you about the fine-tuning of the universe, which seems to me to be powerful evidence of an intelligence behind the universe. I could talk to you about many other things, but what I want to come down to at the very end of this is, we live in the information age. And it's fascinating when you begin to study life. They used to think it was like blobs of jelly, or jello as you call it. Now we discover that the genetic basis of life is linguistic. There is a word, but it's not only linguistic. It's mechanical engineering of the most unbelievable sort. And tomorrow night, there's going to be a lecture by Dr. Tour, who's here tonight. And he is going to give you insight into just the bewildering complexity of the nanotechnologies in biology. But the important thing is, which even chemists with the most brilliant minds cannot reproduce. And I encourage you very much to come to him. I'll hide behind him because I'm not an expert in these things. I just want to pick up one thing, and it's this. Language, as I said at the beginning, fascinates me. And so I'm faced with these two worldviews. One of them says in the beginning was mass energy, the particles, or now the favorite is nothing. Or a quantum vacuum, which isn't nothing, or something like that. And everything else is derivative, including mind. There's another worldview, and it goes like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him, and without him nothing came to be that came to be. See the difference? This is saying that information, logos, the word, energy, intelligence, command, it's a whole spectrum of meanings. The Word is a personal God behind the universe. That's the primary thing in the universe. It's not mass energy at all. Mass energy is derivative. And now, for the first time in history, we've got 21st century physics, which is pushing information right into the center point of importance. Biology is doing the same thing, because it's adapting the language of theoretical computer science to describe what's going on. And isn't it fascinating that information is not material? It's carried on material, but it itself isn't material. That's an end to my mind of materialism. And there are some scientists even suggesting at the level of physics, they put it rather quaintly, they say it's bit before it rather than it before bit. In other words, they're asserting the primary nature of information. Yes, no, 0, 1. Quantization of fundamental things. This is fascinating to me. So, here's an interesting thing. In a document written many centuries ago, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And God said, and God said, and God said. This is a universe, according to that account, built up out of speech acts. It's not a closed system of cause and effect. It's an open system that can respond to information and energy fed from outside. That's a huge statement. How did they know? And come up to 20 centuries ago, to the time of the New Testament. In the beginning was the Word. All things came to be through him. You see, that makes perfect sense to me as a scientist. And in each of the 10 trillion cells in your body, the Creator has left evidence of his genius. A mind-boggling word which is itself an information-bearing macromolecule, which is in itself responsible for all the machines of unbelievable complexity that go together to operate all those cells in your body of which we're unaware. In the beginning was the Word. There it is. And that's the start, ladies and gentlemen. I only learned that later in life. But you see, all of my life up to that point and to now, I'd come to know that word. Because you see, that's the start of the story from the point of view of the etiology of history, starting with a word that creates. But there's an even bigger claim now. And the Word became human. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The central claim of Christianity is that the one whom we know as Jesus Christ invented the atom, invented the mind, invented all the chemistry we have. That's a staggering claim. He stood on our planet. He was about 30 then. And he said, I am the truth. Not I speak true things, although that was true. I am the truth. And I hope at Rice University you're taught to ask questions. Do the questions go on forever? That's an interesting question, isn't it? Well, I suspect that if you ask the truth about a flower, you'll soon get down to the chemical level, then you'll get down to the atomic level. If you keep going, you'll find not a theory, you'll find a person saying, I am the truth. Now that's such a huge, huge claim. You would want evidence for it. And my final point is this. There is such confusion in our contemporary world about what we mean by faith. The atheists have done a very clever job, particularly Dawkins, in defining faith as believing where you know there's no evidence. So that for many people, faith is a religious term that means believing where there's no evidence. So I'm often asked to give lectures under the topic faith and science. And I say to people, do you want me to talk about God? And they say, of course we do. I said, I don't see God in this thing. Well, there's faith. Well, I said, what do you mean by faith? Oh, you mean faith in God? Oh, I see. Because faith is essential to science. Of course it is. Every scientist must believe before they do any science that the universe is rationally intelligible. Einstein said, I cannot imagine any scientist without that faith. And what's happened in our culture is very cleverly, people who ought to know better, have relegated faith to the religious sphere and then says it means believing where there's no evidence. That's blind faith, and it is very dangerous. But I trust my faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe is not blind. I have evidence for it. It works. And it's exactly the same, but much deeper. My faith in Christ is not blind faith. It's based on evidence. And you can see that. It's important to listen to what the Christian faith says before you judge it. And if you ask what evidence is it based on, well, listen to this. This is at the very end of John's Gospel that I quoted. In the beginning was the Word at the beginning. John writing says, many other signs Jesus did in the presence of his disciples which are not written in this book. But these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, here's the evidence. Have you ever read it as an adult? You see, one of the things that convinces me of the truth of Christianity is you can be utterly open and honest with Christ and ask your questions. And I've lived with this for 60 years now and can only say that the more I live with it, the more I see it's real. Final point. Many people say, oh, come on. You're a scientist. We're taught that everything in science is testable. It makes predictions. And that's why we're confident in it. We can do repeated experiments. You can't do that in Christianity. Of course you can, ladies and gentlemen. Of course you can. Let me give you one example. And it's staggering, of course, but I give it for that reason. Every human being I've ever met has a problem with the meaning of life and the question of guilt and forgiveness and all that kind of stuff. And if we're honest, we find we've messed up. Is there forgiveness? Well, this is what Christ says, that if we face that and honestly repent of it, he will give us forgiveness. He'll give us more than that. He'll give us eternal life, the vibrating life of God, which is real. You can test that. If I hadn't seen it tested thousands of times, I wouldn't be here. I watch people. I watch their marriages falling apart. And then somebody tells them that they can find forgiveness and healing and new life in Christ. And their marriage comes together. And you could say, well, that's only psychology. But it's happening. I see people dependent on drugs and alcohol. And I see suddenly that dependence is gone. I come along and say, what happened to you? Well, actually, I met Jesus Christ and he's changed me. You see that again and again and again and again and again and again. Of course you can test Christianity. Otherwise I wouldn't stand here for a moment. So has science buried God? No. Atheism is on its way to burying God. But all of us, especially when we're young, we have the opportunity at university to engage with people of differing worldviews. Because my quest for all these years has been motivated by one thing. I don't want to be fooled. I grew up in one environment which was Christian. I bent over backwards to expose my thinking to its exact opposite in many different ways. And all I can say, it may not be much, but it is the fact, that the more I've opened up myself to criticism and argument, the more I've discovered that there's a resilience in the Christian faith that is utterly unique. To say nothing of its effect in my marriage and in my family, but that's another story. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lennox, for your insight on the relationship between science and faith in God. I hope you've been texting your questions to RiceQ, plus your question to 22333. If you haven't done so, you can continue to do that now. And Dr. Lennox is going to come back and begin answering some of your questions. Continue to text your questions as he speaks.
Well, now, you've been very patient, haven't you? You've been dying to have a go at me. I know that. And this is actually an important time because it feeds me and also it challenges me. But it's a Q&A. And you're about to find out how inadequate a Q&A is. First of all, you will plumb the depths of my ignorance in the first 10 seconds, probably. Secondly, all I can do at this stage is to react, immediate reaction, gut reaction, to how I would begin to face your question. So you're going to find it's inadequate, but that's a good thing. Because if you've come tonight with a real question, you will not be satisfied with anything I say tonight in beginning to get into it. You'll go and do research, ask other people, and the thing will become real to you. So although the process is inadequate, it's a good process. So let's have a look. I have a huge screen here of questions. And we're going to look at as many of them as I can. So can you please fasten your safety belts? And we'll go. Right. Are scientific views of the origin of the universe and life, i.e. Big Bang and evolution, compatible with the religious view of the origin of life? Now here we have it. Immediately, the alternatives, either or. What I've been trying to say for the past hour is that you can regard these as compatible, but let me pick up specifics. People come to me sometimes and say, you know, I'm sorry, I believe in Genesis, I don't believe in the Big Bang. And I say, just a minute, what does Big Bang mean? Big Bang was an idea coined by Fred Hoyle, who was one of my examiners at Cambridge, a brilliant astrophysicist, who hated the idea. Because when the evidence of a beginning to space-time began to come in the 1960s, you don't remember this, you see, but I can't blame you. But you need to know what happened. The scientific establishment closed in and wanted to stop it. The editor of Nature, John Lennox at the time, says we mustn't go down this route of a beginning to space-time. Why? It'll give too much leverage to people who believe the Bible. So there, one of the major scientific results of the 20th century was being resisted because it paralleled the Bible. But it won through by dint of the evidence. Big Bang is just a pleasant way of saying there was a beginning. That's all it's saying. So it's agreeing with Genesis, full stop. So no Christian should be afraid of it. Now, evolution is more controversial. That's why I wrote a book on it, which you can get outside, because it's... Well, I've noticed that all TV programs in the United States have commercials. And so I'm fitting in with that. But seriously, ladies and gentlemen, when I argued to you that Newton's gravity, he discovers how it works. There's a mechanism in the law, say, roughly speaking. He didn't say, I've got a mechanism in the law that does something, therefore there's no God. Now, if you think, let's think specifically of the neo-Darwinian mechanism, mutation and natural selection, genetic drift, and a few other things. They clearly do something. If you don't believe that, have a look around this room. Do you know you're a result of selection, usually? And I know that even at universities like Rice, there's a good deal of selection going on, even in lectures like this. And there's mutation. It does something. That's not an argument for saying there isn't a God who's behind nature. You see, the problem is there are two questions and they get confused. The one is, can you deduce atheism from biology? And the answer is no, they're not even in the same category. Biology is a science. Atheism is a worldview. You can't deduce a worldview from a science. The second question is, do these mechanisms bear all the weight that's put on them? That's a scientific question. And there, in my view, but I'm a mathematician, so you don't need to listen to me. In my view, there is a lot of difficulty in there, and that's why I wrote my little book. So that's why many people across the spectrum, some scientists have difficulties with evolution in the sense of neo-Darwinism. I certainly do. Some don't, but they all believe in God. You mustn't do, and here's the principle, the existence of a mechanism that does something is not an argument for the non-existence of a creator who ultimately stands behind it. So that's the first thing. Now, what of the discovery of water on Mars? That's somebody hearing the news today. So that's very quick. I haven't had much time to think of water on Mars, but I'd like some here. What do the implications of possible life on other planets mean from religion? Well, nothing, so far as I know. As a Christian, you see, I have a database. As a scientist, I have a database, the universe. Francis Bacon, the father of science, talks about God's two books. The book of nature, we read it with our reason. The book of God's word, which we also read with our reason. Notice. We don't switch off our reason when we're presented with the Bible, otherwise we'd be foolish. And it doesn't tell us everything. I mean, you must have noticed that the Bible is not a textbook of mathematics. I don't teach algebra from Leviticus. Now, that's one side of it, but the other side of it is there are certain places, not very many, but they're important, where the Bible talks about the same universe that science talks about. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is a statement about the physical universe, every much as the statements that comprise the standard Big Bang model of the universe, you see. So we've got to be careful that we don't make it an either or, but the Bible tends to deal with bigger questions, roughly speaking. The natural sciences deal with the how and the why of function, whereas the Bible deals with the question of why of purpose and so on. That's a rough matrix. So if we come back to this, it's not telling us everything. Now, the mandate for the fundamental academic discipline comes on page 2 of the Bible. Did you know that? What is the fundamental intellectual activity? It's taxonomy, giving names to things. Some of you medics are suffering, aren't you? Every blessed bone in the body, you've got to know the name of it. And it's the same with the periodic table and all the biochemistry and all the rest of it. Names of things. It's the same in philosophy or applied basket weaving or whatever you're studying. Isn't that true? Taxonomy is the fundamental thing. And isn't it interesting that in an ancient text, which so many people dismiss, God named about 5 things in the universe, and then he told the human beings, you name the animals. That's the beginning of biology, isn't it? And God told man to do it. That's a pretty positive mandate for science, isn't it? Name things. And that's what we have fun doing. In mathematics, of course, we can name things anything we like, and I've done so. It's great fun giving names to new things and concepts. But this is very important because it tells us what those early pioneers of science had in the backs of their minds. They were doing a God thing. They weren't getting rid of God. They were massively pushed forward to do it. Now, if the Bible doesn't talk about Mars or even life on it, it talks about the stars a little bit, well, then we can go and find out for ourselves. But we jump to conclusions very rapidly. We think we found water, so we found life, have we? Does life exist where water exists? Now, I just don't know the answers to these questions. Is there life outside? Well, Paul Davies, whom I know a little bit, is a brilliant writer, science writer. He's not a theist. And he wrote a book, Are We Alone? And I was asked to discuss this book on radio with him. And he said interesting things. He said, you know, as a human being, I like to feel we're not alone. But as a scientist, I have to be honest. I think the science goes to show that we are essentially alone. And eventually they came to me and I said, Professor Lennox, do you believe in any extraterrestrial life? And I said, yes, one very big one. He's called God. And I meant that seriously. You see, even the Bible says this universe is not the only one that exists. This reality, as we think of it, is very complex. We've seen that at the microscopic level of quantum mechanics and so on. We've seen it in the difficulties we have in answering questions like, what is energy? What is matter? What is life? What is consciousness? What's the relationship between the brain and the mind? We're virtually nowhere in these huge questions. So there are vast mysteries in the universe, and we wonder at them. So my answer to the question is, I don't know anything that would affect any belief I have in God, because so far it has held me in very good stead. But we leave that. Let's go on. How would you compare the religious quest for truth to the scientific one? Are there foundations of knowledge structured in the same way? Well, yes and no. The question is very important. Why? Because many students and others are told that science is coextensive with rationality. That science is the only way to truth. We call that scientism. I call it scientific fundamentalism. I've written about it because it seems to me to be a very important concept. Only one answer will do. Other answers are ruled out. Science is the only way to truth. But half a minute. Are you interested in logic at this time of the night? Well, I'll try and see. I know often it's a lost cause, but never mind. The statement, science is the only way to truth, is that a statement of science? No. Well, then if it's true, it's false. Oh, it is too late for logic, so we'll go on. The foundations of knowledge depend on the level at which we're understanding things. Knowing about a nanomachine, what does that involve? Well, it involves knowing about chemistry, physics, microscopy, and all sorts of complex things. Knowing my wife, well, you can take microscopes and telescopes and all sorts of things and fit her up with electrodes. You'll never get to know her. How do you get to know a person? By revelation, actually. You'll never get to know me if I don't reveal myself to you, will you? And yet if I do, it'll be in words mostly, perhaps gestures and attitudes, and you read them, and you'll understand. Now you see, we can use that as a way of understanding that when we're approaching the God question, we're not simply approaching something made of physics and chemistry, that is a material object, nor are we approaching a mere theory or set of theories. The central claim is that God is a person. And so you have to open your minds to a much wider spectrum of evidences that we have a person. Some of them are physical, of course. I see my wife through my eyes. The sound waves carry the sound of her voice. There's touch and all the rest of it. And there's that side of the scientific investigation, if you like. But is that enough? No, it isn't. You see? So what is so important to me is that we grasp this. Science and rationality don't end at the same point. Otherwise, of course, you'd have to shut half the faculties at Rice. There'd be no more history, there'd be no more literature, there'd be no more languages. It is absurd. And yet, what does Stephen Hawking say? The big questions of life used to be the provenance of philosophy. Now philosophy is dead. This is in his book, The Grand Design. And scientists are left as torchbearers of truth in the current generation. What? The irony of that is, saying philosophy is dead, the rest of the book is about the philosophy of science. And that's another problem, ladies and gentlemen. Do you know what I've been doing tonight? I hope you've noticed. I've been going outside my field of mathematics. I haven't said a word about algebra, except in connection with Leviticus. So I'm going outside my field. That's risky. But I have to go outside my field. Many others do. Dawkins is going outside his field. When Carl Sagan said on his Cosmos series, the universe is all that is, was, or ever shall be, he was speaking as a scientist. He wasn't talking science. And we need to realize two things. Science does not give us an authority to pronounce anywhere else. So when we do, as I've done tonight, we need to check the best case, the very best case of the people we're talking about. Richard Feynman once said something very good. He said, when it comes to anything outside science, the scientist is just as dumb as the next guy. And he won the Nobel Prize. But listen to this. Not every statement by a scientist is a statement of science. Science and rationality aren't coextensive. Thinking about God is a rational activity. Now, it involves more, because it may lead you to a relationship with God which will use every aspect of your personality, including your spirit, and it has a moral dimension as well. But it's not less than a scientific endeavor. It's much more. So that's how I would go to that. Logic is as important when it comes to talking about God as when it's talking about the structure of mathematics. Now, what's the next one? Let's see. Whoa. Just very briefly, you mentioned pantheism at the beginning of your lecture. Where does it fall in this discussion? Well, now, it falls roughly like this. And this is crude, so forgive me, because it has to be fast. The theistic view says there is a God, there is a universe, and they're different. The atheistic view says there's a universe and there's no God. The pantheistic says there is a God in some sense, there is a universe, and they're exactly the same. That God gets conflated with the universe. And so this idea of God being essential being is something that's favored by some physicists. And you get books like The Tao of Physics by Fritjof Capra and so on. But that's roughly where it fits. But in the Western Academy, the main contenders are, of course, are naturalism, atheistic, and theism, in my case, Christian. Now, what about this? Doesn't our knowledge of the laws of nature make belief in miracles impossible? No. Shall I say a bit more? This is one of the biggest issues that comes up. I'm sorry I hadn't time to build it into my talk, and I'm glad that somebody has raised it, because often the argument comes like this, and you'll hear Dawkins mocking me over this on radio, you know. And when he was talking to me, he said, we could be talking about the God of the physicists and all that, but I've met Lennox before, and he actually believes that Jesus walked on water. What? I'm afraid I was cheeky. And I said, if Jesus is the Son of God who invented water, then perhaps walking on it wasn't such a big problem. And I meant it. But to be more serious, David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, made a statement that's quoted again and again and again. And the last big discussion I had on it was with the late Christopher Hitchens. Miracles are violations of the laws of nature. We now know the laws of nature. End of story. Forget Christianity with its centrality of the resurrection and all these other lesser miracles. Forget it. It's impossible to be an intellectual and believe in these supernatural acts. By the way, the word miracle simply means something to be wondered at. What we're talking about is the supernatural that doesn't fit into the cause-effect sequence that science studies. So what do I say about that? Well, I'll tell you what I say, and I'm going to, rather than philosophize, I'm just going to give you Lewis's approach to it, which I found when I was about 15 to be decisive, and I've never found any reason to change my mind. I'm staying in a hotel tonight, I hope, and I stayed in one last night. Suppose I'm staying in the same hotel, so I put $100 in the drawer on night one. I put $100 in the drawer on night two. How many dollars have I got? 200. I wake up in the morning and I find $50. Now, my wife's not with me, so she hasn't put her hand in. Now, what do I conclude when I find $50? Do I conclude, A, that the laws of arithmetic have been broken? Or do I conclude that the laws of Texas have been broken? Well, what do I conclude? What do I conclude? What's been broken? Yes. How do you know that? Because the laws of arithmetic haven't been broken. Isn't that interesting? It's a very simple analogy, but it was thought up by a very clever man. You see, I thought that the drawer represented a closed system of cause and effect. Do you see? But it wasn't. It was open. So somebody could put their hand in. Did he break the laws of arithmetic? Of course not. But I wouldn't know that he was a thief if I didn't know the laws of arithmetic. If I said, oh, well, 2 plus 2 equals 4 yesterday, but they equal 3 today, well, that's very interesting. Yes. See, now here's the fascinating thing. The only way you can recognize the supernatural is by knowing nature's laws. Now, this is so interesting because, you see, David Hume also went on to say something very silly. He said in the days of the New Testament, it was pre-scientific. Well, it was in terms of history. It was pre-modern science. They didn't know the laws of nature, so they could believe in all this hocus-pocus stuff. But now we know the laws of nature. But has he ever read the New Testament? Joseph found that his fiancée was pregnant, and he hadn't a notion where babies came from. And so, of course, he embraced her and took her to be his wife. He didn't. He wanted to divorce her. Why? Because he knew as well as you and I do where babies come from. He knew the law of nature. And it took an enormous special visitation from God for him to open up his heart to this young woman. The man born blind that Jesus healed, it's a hilarious. Do read it sometime with modern eyes. The people didn't believe he was the man, and suddenly he said to them, look, you guys, he was talking to high-powered professional theologian. He said, look, you guys, since the beginning of the world, it's never been heard that a man born blind has got his eyesight. He knew the law. So he recognized that something had happened to him. Now, here's the point. What happened to him was not a result of natural processes going on in his eyeballs the split second it happened. That would be breaking the laws of nature. What happened when Jesus rose from the dead was not a result of something going on in the tomb 3 seconds before it happened. The Bible tells you exactly what it was. It was an injection into an open system of colossal power. God raised Jesus from the dead. Science can say nothing about that at all, except that science can establish the norm, that it's not usual for dead people to rise. I hope you've noticed that. I mean, if people were popping out of the graves all over Houston, and somebody said, well, Jesus rose from the dead, you said, so what? I saw 4 last week. So I hope you've got the point. That, and it's a seriously important point, there's such confusion about the nature of the uniformity of nature. You see, going to the scientific level, as scientists, we assume that nature is mostly uniform. Otherwise, you couldn't do any science. You did an experiment yesterday. You split water up into hydrogen and oxygen. You expect to get the same today. You saw the sun rise yesterday. At least you can see the sun in Texas occasionally. We can't. You saw the sun rise. You expect it to happen tomorrow. The course of nature is normally uniform. If it weren't, you would never recognize anything special. And the point is that we've got a God who creates a universe with built-in regularities which we can study, fascinating in terms of mathematics. But he's not a prisoner of his laws. Why? Because they're not laws like the laws of Texas. The whole problem arises out of introducing the concept of forensic law, the legal concept, into the concept of a law of nature and science. The word law means totally different things in both cases, as you can see with Lewis's analogy. So then, with many of my colleagues, you see, they won't listen to me talk about the evidence for the resurrection, on which my faith in Christ is based. They say, look, but it can't happen because Hume said. I said, no, he didn't. He was wrong. And by the way, just before the end of his life, the world's greatest interpreter of David Hume, Anthony Flew, a brilliant philosopher who was the Dawkins of his day, a prominent atheist, got converted to deism or theism of some kind through the structure of DNA, incidentally, which annoyed his colleagues all over the place. And I had an interview with him for a couple of hours, some weeks, months before his death. And I asked him about his books on Hume, and he said, I was wrong about Hume. He said, I'd love to write those books again, but I'll never be able to do so. I was simply wrong. That's a fantastically humble admission, isn't it? But don't let Hume put you off from thinking seriously about it. This argument that I've just given, and there's much more, I've written about that too, but I won't advertise that because you might feel I was going too far. That I have done. I've looked at the whole question of miracles through the eyes of David Hume and his criteria for witnesses and applied them to the resurrection of Jesus. As I said before, I don't want to be fooled. And the resurrection is claimed by the early Christians and Christians today as the major public event in history that begins to tell us who Jesus is, the Son of God, not merely the carpenter from Nazareth, but God incarnate. The argument I've just given you very briefly wipes away, to my mind, the in-principle argument against miracles in general. But of course, I'm not gullible. At least I hope I'm not. I don't believe in every claim to miracle. That's why I'm concentrating on the miracles of the New Testament. Whether a particular miracle has happened or not, of course, is a question of investigating the available evidence. And here the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is enormously strong. Now, we're very near the end. And the question has been raised about the testability of Christianity. I have answered that. And somebody has very perceptively, and this is the very last one. In this talk, you seem to conflate religion with Christianity. What about the other Abrahamic religions, or Buddhism, or Hinduism? That's a very valid question, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be as fast as I can with this. I will never address that question until I've addressed a prior question. And that is, if you look around the world at all the religions listed here and everyone else, you will find a common base of morality. The golden rule, do unto others as you would they do to you, is found everywhere. Now, what does that prove? From where I sit, it proves that whether we believe in God or not, we are moral beings. We've got a conscience. We come up with roughly the same things. Now, that's very important, because when you start to discuss the differences between religion, the danger is you talk down, and people think that you're saying they're better, they're worse than you are. Let me tell you, I believe this so strongly, that we're made in the image of God, that my atheist friends could put me to shame. That's very important to realize that. In the Bible, Abraham, the great patriarch mentioned here, was put to shame by a complete heathen, as we would call him in the ancient language, who had a higher moral standard than he had. So when we can look other people eye to eye and value them in that way, we can discuss that there are differences. Now, leave Christianity out of it. There are obviously differences between religions. The only people I find who insist they're all the same are atheists who don't believe any of them anyway. But you insult people of other religions if you say we all believe the same thing. My Muslim friends know that I don't agree with them, but they want me to say what I believe because they're going to say what they believe. And similarly, my many Jewish friends and so on. Now, how do you decide between them? Well, one way of doing it is by asking for evidence. Now, let me take a central thing. This is just one. I have many friends from any religion you can name, but let's take the Abrahamic ones. My Jewish friends believe that Jesus died and never rose. My Muslim friends believe he never died. I believe he did both. Elementary logic tells you that all those three things cannot be true. So how do you decide? The only way I know of deciding is look at the evidence. And you're as entitled to come up with your view as I am to mine. This is one of the things I encourage. Let's look at the evidence openly. And when people come to different conclusions, respect their conclusions. So that's the first thing. We can test claims. But there's a second thing, and it's this. Let's take the word religion. Forget about any specific religion. Well, Rice University is the typical example. I think, do you have an entrance qualification, or does everybody get in? Oh, everybody doesn't get in. So you have nothing to draw on. Is this a university? Never mind, never mind. I thought it was a university, but there we are. Just use your imagination, your visual imagination. So we've got a door into Rice. Exams, you get in. Initiation ceremony, so you're in. Now imagine a wavy line. That's your life at Rice University. Sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. Now imagine on the wavy line, there are professors, the little stick with a little head and a professor's hat on. Now, what are they there for? Well, they're there to be kind to you and teach you and cajole you and encourage you and so on. But as you're along this wavy line, you're getting nearer and nearer to a huge, big, formidable door at the end. It's called finals. The day of judgment. And you imagine that there it is, the scales of justice. You know the scales of justice, as in the Statue of Liberty. So you're on the way at Rice University. Now, the professors may really think you're stunning in your ability. But you know, they can't guarantee that you're going to get a degree, can they? Why is that? Well, because the basis is your merit, isn't it? And if a professor came along to you and said, you're going to get a top degree, you'd say, how do you know? It's my merit. You may fail. Now, many people, in fact, most people, indeed many professing Christians believe that's exactly what they're onto. There's an initiation at the beginning, some rite or something. They're in on the way, and then they've got gurus or priests or all sorts of people to help them. But because the basic principle is merit, at the judgment day, God will sift out their good from their bad, and he will then and only then decide whether they can be accepted. Yes? That's the general idea of religion. Now, I want to shock you possibly to say that that is not Christianity. Christianity deals with the problem at the end, at the very beginning. I want you to imagine that first door replaced by a cross. Now, here's the astonishing difference. In a university like Rice, you cannot know until you're through that final door whether you've got your degree or not. The genius, if I might put it that way, of Christianity is that acceptance comes at the beginning. Why? Because the central message that backs behind the resurrection is that when Jesus died on that cross, he took my sin upon him. Now, that may sound mumbo-jumbo to you, but at least listen to it before you reject it. That he dealt with all the stuff that messes up my life and gives me forgiveness at the beginning. Let me give you an illustration. Do you remember what I told you at the beginning? I saw this 16-year-old vision at the beginning. Oh, but I need to tell you something else about her, and with this I finish. I thought it'd be a good idea to marry her eventually. Now, I'm a mathematician. It took me an awful long time to make my mind up. So one day I came to her and I presented her with a book. It was a cookbook. So I said, Sally, I think it would be great if you and I, well, you know what I mean. If we got married, and the principle of our marriage is going to be this. Do you see this cookbook? Oh, yes, beautiful. Page 173, apple cake. I said, you see the laws about making apple cake. Thou shalt take 200 grams of sugar. Thou shalt take this. Thou shalt take that. Thou shalt put them together in a bowl, mix them up, put them in an oven to so many degrees centigrade, and thou shalt get an apple cake. Well, she said, what's the deal? Very simple. If you keep those rules for, let's say, 30 or 40 years, then I'll think of accepting you. Will you marry me? What? What would you think about that as a proposition? It's crazy, yet that's what millions of people believe about God. Exactly that. If I keep the rules, whatever they are, whatever they may call themselves in the Bible or anywhere else, for 40 or 50 years, I desperately hope you'll accept me. I'm going to be very strong here, because I want you to remember this. You would not insult a fellow human being by suggesting that a relationship is based on merit. So I didn't give her a cookbook, although I've given her many since. The secret of our married life, if there's anything to it, is she accepted me. I have no idea why. I know why I accepted her. And it was unconditional, for better or for worse. That's what sets her free to learn to cook. Do you see that? And this is the genius of Christianity. I've made a mess of living. I'm not a good cook when it comes to my own life. And I discovered, fortunately, very early on, that Christ can transform life, forgive you, deal with a big problem. Listen to what he said. It is staggering, this statement. Truly I say to you, if any man hears my word and believes on him that sent me, any woman, she has eternal life right now and shall not come into judgment, but has already passed from death to life. I believe that. Oh, you say, but that's arrogant. You know you're accepted by God. That's arrogant. It would be if it depended on my merit. But if the one who's going to ultimately stand as the final judge tells me, John Lennox, because you trust me to cover your sin and guilt and the mess you've made of life, I accept you and I'll never reject you. It would be utter arrogance for me to say that the one who is the Son of God was telling me a lie. Thank you for listening, and all the very best. Good night.
This has been certainly a very challenging and provocative talk by Dr. Lennox, and we know we couldn't get to all the questions this evening, but thankfully we didn't have to. As Dr. Lennox mentioned, there's going to be another opportunity tomorrow to continue this conversation at 8 o'clock in the Rice Chapel. We're going to have our very own professor of chemistry and of material science and nanoengineering and of computer science, Dr. Tour. And I really could go on for a long time as well. He's going to be giving us a brief summary of what happened today, but then also, more importantly, taking on your questions, fielding questions. So please come. There's going to be Chick-fil-A after Dr. Tour's session of Q&A. That's not why you come, but you know what? It's a pretty sweet deal too, right? Rice Chapel tomorrow at 8 o'clock. Please come. Bring your questions and bring your friends. For those of you who joined us here tonight or who joined us maybe via live stream at the Story Church, thank you so much. Have a good night. Stay here for the reception catered by Rice Coffee House. There's going to be book signing, so please visit the book table as well. Thank you.